Ilara Voss had learned, over 5 long years, that silence was the safest language in Blackthorn House. She learned it the first winter, when the car her parents were driving slid off the icy mountain road and into the trees, and she woke up in a strange stone house, surrounded by people with sharp eyes and sharper teeth. She learned it every morning since, when she rose before dawn to light the fires and scrub the long wooden floors of the pack hall before anyone else was awake. She learned it especially on the days when Wren, the Alpha King's cousin, decided that mockery was more entertaining than breakfast. "Smell that?" Wren said one morning, wrinkling her nose as Ilara passed with a tray of dishes. "It's the human. Still smells like fear. Even after 5 years. You'd think she would get used to us by now." The other pack members at the table laughed, the way they always did. Ilara kept her eyes down and kept walking. She had learned that arguing only made it worse, and that crying only made it last longer. So she said nothing. She simply carried the tray to the kitchen, set it down carefully, and pressed her palms flat against the cool counter until her hands stopped shaking. She was human in a house full of wolves. She had no claws, no fangs, no strength to match theirs, and no family left to call her back to the world outside. The pack had taken her in only because their laws forbade turning away someone found freezing on their land. But taking her in and wanting her were two very different things. 5 years later, she still did not know which was worse, the sharp words of people like Wren, or the silence of the one person who could have stopped them and never did. That person was Dorian Ashgrave, the Alpha King. Ilara rarely saw him up close. He kept to the highest floor of the house, appeared only for pack meetings and formal dinners, and spoke so little that some of the younger wolves whispered he had forgotten how to smile. When their paths did cross in the hallways, he would give her the smallest nod, nothing more, his golden eyes sliding over her, as if she were simply another piece of furniture in his home. Ilara told herself she did not care. A king who ruled over hundreds of wolves had no reason to notice the human girl who mopped his floors. She had made her peace with being invisible to him. It was easier than hoping for anything else. What she had not made peace with was Wren. The days grew worse as autumn came, and the pack prepared for the gathering, a grand meeting of alphas from 3 neighboring territories, held once every few years at Blackthorn House, to renew old alliances. The whole pack buzzed with excitement and nerves. Extra food was prepared, the hall was decorated with candles and dark green banners, and Ilara worked from before sunrise until long past midnight, scrubbing, polishing, folding, carrying. She did not mind the work. Work gave her hands something to do and her mind something to focus on besides loneliness. But work also meant more chances for Wren to find her. "You'll be serving at the head table tonight," Wren told her, the evening before the gathering, a slow smile curling at the corner of her mouth. "Try not to embarrass us in front of our guests. I know it's difficult for you, understanding how things work here, but do try." Ilara only nodded and went back to folding napkins. She had learned that answering back only fed the fire. The night of the gathering arrived cold and clear, the sky above Blackthorn House scattered with more stars than Ilara had ever seen back in the city where she'd grown up. The great hall glowed with candlelight. Visiting alphas and their families filled the long tables, their laughter and low conversation rolling like a tide beneath the high wooden ceiling. Ilara moved between them with trays of food and pitchers of wine, invisible in her plain gray dress, exactly the way she had learned to be. At the head of the hall, on a raised platform, sat Dorian, dressed in dark formal clothing that made him look even more distant than usual. He spoke with the visiting alphas, his voice low and even, his expression carefully unreadable. Ilara did not look at him more than she had to. She had trained herself not to. It was near the middle of the feast, when the hall was loudest with talk and laughter, that Wren found her chance. Ilara was carrying a full pitcher of wine toward the head table, when Wren stepped into her path, seemingly by accident, and knocked her elbow hard into Ilara's arm. The pitcher tipped. Dark red wine splashed across the stone floor and across the hem of Wren's own pale dress, though Ilara suspected, from the flicker in Wren's eyes, that this had been exactly the plan. The hall went quiet. Every head turned. "Look what you've done," Wren said, her voice rising, dramatic and sharp, loud enough for every guest to hear. "In front of everyone. In front of our guests. She looked around at the visiting alphas with an expression of practiced embarrassment. This is what happens when you let humans serve at important events. She has no idea how to behave. Alara's face burned. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, some curious, some amused, a few even pitying, which somehow felt worse than the mockery. Her hands trembled around the empty pitcher. "Clean it up," Ren said, her voice dropping into something colder. "Kneel down and clean it properly, the way you should have done from the start." For 5 years, Alara had followed instructions like this without argument. She had knelt before, cleaned before, swallowed her pride more times than she could count, because there had never been another choice. She began to lower herself to the floor, reaching for the cloth at her waist, already bracing for the humiliation to pass the way it always did. But before her knees touched the stone, a chair scraped back at the head of the hall. Dorian Ashgrave rose from his seat. The hall, already quiet, fell into complete silence. Every wolf in the room turned to watch their king cross the floor in slow, deliberate steps, his dark eyes fixed not on Ren, and not on the spilled wine, but on Alara. He stopped in front of her. And then, in front of every alpha, every guest, every member of his own pack, Dorian Ashgrave knelt. He knelt on one knee before Alara Voss, the human servant girl the pack had mocked for 5 years, his head bowed slightly, his hand extended upward toward hers, not to pull her down, but to help her remain standing. For a long moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Alara stared down at him, certain she was imagining it, certain the wine had somehow gone to her own head, even though she had not tasted a drop. "Alara," Dorian said quietly, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall. "You do not kneel. Not to her. Not to anyone in this house." Ren's face had gone pale. "Dorian, what are you—" "Cousin," Dorian said, still not rising, still not taking his eyes from Alara's face. "You will apologize. Now. In front of everyone you tried to shame her before." Ren opened her mouth, closed it, and then, under the weight of dozens of watching eyes, and the unmistakable authority in her Alpha King's voice, bowed her head. "I apologize," she said stiffly, the words clearly costing her something. "It was wrong of me." Dorian finally rose to his feet, though he kept himself half a step in front of Alara, as if shielding her from the room. He turned to face the hall, his expression no longer distant or unreadable, but open in a way none of them had ever seen. "5 years ago," he said, his voice steady enough to reach every corner of the hall, "I found a car off the mountain road during the worst storm we'd had in a decade. Inside, I found a young woman, barely alive, with no wolf blood in her veins at all. By every law of this pack, I should have left her to the humans who came searching, or handed her to the nearest town once she recovered. Instead, I brought her here." He paused, glancing briefly at Alara before continuing. "I did not tell anyone the full truth of why, because I did not fully understand it myself at the time. But I have known, since the night I found her, that her blood carries a mark our pack's oldest stories speak of, a bloodline said to appear once in a great while, bound by fate to walk beside an Alpha King and strengthen the pack for generations after. I have spent 5 years watching her, waiting, uncertain, telling myself I needed proof before I said anything. I told myself silence was wisdom. I was wrong. My silence was cowardice, and it allowed cruelty to grow in this house that should never have been permitted." Murmurs rippled through the hall, disbelief mixing with dawning understanding. Alara felt her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone in the hall must be able to hear it. Dorian turned back to her fully now, his golden eyes softer than she had ever seen them. "I did not kneel tonight because of prophecy, or bloodlines, or old stories," he said, quieter now, though the hall was so silent his words still reached every ear. "I knelt because I watched you lower yourself to the ground, one time too many in this house, and I could not stand by and let it happen again. Not for one more day." Alara's throat felt tight. 5 years of swallowed words, 5 years of small humiliations she had carried alone, rose up all at once, and she found she could not speak at all. "Why?" she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper, though in the silent hall, everyone heard it. "Why did you let it happen for so long? If you knew. Dorian's jaw tightened, something like regret passing over his features. Because I told myself that if I said anything too soon, it would look like I was only protecting you for the pack's benefit, not because I saw you, he said. I wanted you to have 5 years without my name attached to yours, so that if you ever chose to stand beside me, it would be your choice, not an obligation. I see now that in trying to give you that freedom, I gave you nothing but loneliness instead. That is my failure, Elara, not yours. The hall remained silent, every guest and pack member watching the two of them as though the rest of the world had fallen away. Elara looked at him for a long moment, this man who had watched from a distance for 5 years, who she had believed did not see her at all, who had, in truth, seen everything and said nothing, waiting for a moment that never seemed to come until tonight. She thought of every meal she had eaten alone in the kitchen, every insult she had swallowed, every night she had cried quietly enough that no wolf's sharp hearing would catch it. And yet, here he was, kneeling in front of the very people who had mocked her, refusing to let her kneel instead. I don't know what I am to this pack, she said finally, her voice steadier now. I don't know what an old bloodline or a prophecy means. I only know how it felt to be invisible here for 5 years. You were never invisible to me, Dorian said quietly. That was always the problem. Later that night, after the guests had gone quiet with wonder rather than mockery, and the hall had slowly emptied, Dorian found Elara alone on the wide stone balcony that overlooked the dark mountains, the same mountains where her old life had ended, and, though she hadn't known it then, her new one had begun. He did not say anything grand. He simply stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and looked out at the same stars she was watching. You don't have to decide anything tonight, he said after a while. Not about bloodlines, not about the pack, not about me. I only wanted you to know the truth, and I wanted this house to know it too, so that no one mocks you again. Elara glanced sideways at him, at the king who had kneeled in front of his entire pack for her sake, and felt something in her chest loosen that had been tight for 5 long years. Maybe I don't need time to decide everything, she said quietly, but I would like it, if you're willing, to start with something simpler. I would like you to actually talk to me, not from across a hall, not with silence, just talk to me. For the first time since she had known him, Dorian Ashgrave smiled, small and real. I think, he said, I can manage that. In the weeks that followed, the pack that had once mocked Elara Voss slowly learned to see her differently, not because of an old bloodline whispered about in ancient stories, but because their king had shown them, without a single word of command, exactly what kind of person deserved their respect. Ren, humbled and quieter now, began to greet Elara by name instead of insult. The kitchen staff no longer left her to eat alone, and each evening, when the work of the day was finally done, Elara found herself walking, without fear, toward the highest floor of Blackthorn House, where a king who had once seemed unreachable now waited simply to talk with her, exactly as she had asked. She had spent 5 years believing she was invisible in that house. She had been wrong. She had simply been waiting for someone brave enough to kneel and prove it.